Good morning, I'm Jeff Clark. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees here at the Unitarian Universalist Society of Amherst. I use he, him pronouns. So welcome to you old friends and new, young and old, in Zoom, in the sanctuary. You are an essential part of our celebration today, and whether this is your first or your 1000th Sunday in our midst, we're stronger because you're with us. We are one people of many beliefs, many origins, sexualities, and genders. We are all growing, all learning, all loved. Just as you are welcome here. So one of the things you've probably heard on previous Sundays is the board is inviting you to participate in providing feedback. So we have our little table at the social hour, so you can drop by and give us your 2 cents. We also opened up 15 minutes of every board meeting, so it's open to feedback, so just let one of the board members know you're coming, and we'd be happy to have you there. And you can also send your thoughts to board@uusocietyamherst.org. So we're grateful to be in community with you today. Thank you.
I'm Andrew Coate, Director of Religious Education here. My pronouns are he, him, his. Today, we are thinking about Halloween and honoring our ancestors. We ask that the balcony seating area be reserved for those who are wearing masks, by which we mean COVID masks, not Halloween masks. Our ancestors' ritual will take place when we usually share our joys and sorrows. If you come with a joy or sorrow this week, you are welcome to write it in the book by the windows at any point during today's service. And if you'd like to share aloud next week, we'll have spoken joys and sorrows then.
I am the Reverend Rachael. I use she, her pronouns. I call us to worship this morning with these words from Andrea Hawkins Camper. Gather we now into this space, this time when the wheel turns and the veil shatters. Gather we now to remember, to grieve, to prophesy, to complete our harvests before the long dark comes. Gather we now to tell the old stories and sing the old songs, to be as we have always been, the voice of our people eternal. Gather we now to celebrate that which was, that which is, and that which will be. Gather we now as we have always done, united by story and bound by love. Come, let us worship.
Will you please join me in the words of our chalice lighting as printed on the screen and in your order of worship? We light this flame to invite a world of peace where we heal the wounds, where we share what we have with one another, where justice is another word for relationship, and we listen for what love has to say.
I invite you to rise in body and spirit to sing number 389 in your hymnal, Gathered Here.
Gathered here in the mystery of the hour, gathered here in one strong body, gathered here in the struggle and the power, Spirit draw near. Gathered here in the mystery of the hour, gathered here in one strong body, gathered here in struggle and the body, scattered here from the struggle and the power, scattered here in the mystery of the hour, gathered here in the mystery of the body, gathered here in struggle and body, scattered here from the struggle and the power, Spirit draw near.
I'm going to invite any children who are here to come forward. You don't have to, but you're welcome to. Now, I'm not sure if anyone else has noticed, but there seem to be some interesting outfits today. But I guess there's probably no reason for that, right? I may have prepared my daughter with an answer to a question for later. She may be very excited about it. So, we can all just say it together. What is happening on Tuesday? Halloween. And what are you guys going to do on Tuesday? Trick or treat. They're going to get candy, put it in their bags, and then they can eat some. Now, I think one very important Halloween tradition that the kids might not know about is called the parent tax. And the parent tax is a special thing that happens after the kids go to bed on Halloween. I'm totally kidding. This has never happened. So I'm wondering though, how long ago do you think Halloween started? A while ago, a long time ago. 300 minutes ago. 300 years ago. Does anyone want to guess what country what we now celebrate as Halloween started in? Ireland. So it started in Ireland, a lot of what we now celebrate. Now, of course, there are traditions from all over the world where people honored this time of year as the light starts dying away and as people say the veil between the world thins. That Ireland is where we got that sort of phrasing. And now in Ireland, what they celebrated or what they thought happened was on this evening, and it wasn't called Halloween. Does anyone know what it was called?
Samhain.
Samhain. on this evening, on Samhain, they thought that this is when we were most connected to that other world, when the fairy mounds would open up and all kinds of creatures would come out, fairies and elves, and they would be in the same world with us. Are they real? They're not? Fairies are real, yeah. I was gonna say. And so as these traditions grew, people would come together and they would light bonfires and they would dance and sing and celebrate and eat and celebrate this time of harvest, but also come together for this growing colder part of the year. And what do you think they would carve? Wood. Pumpkins, turnips. They didn't have pumpkins in Ireland. They had turnips, and they would carve turnips, which, by the way, I tried thinking this would be a fun activity for the children. It is not. I don't know how this happened. But they would carve these little faces in turnips and put candles in them and put them out to ward off evil spirits. And as these traditions grew and people moved to the United States and around the world, they brought these traditions with them. And things changed because who here has carved a turnip? But who here has carved a pumpkin? Who here has ever been to a bonfire at this time of year? Or campfire? Who here has ever eaten something yummy with friends this time of year? Eaten something yummy with friends. So we have all of these traditions, many of which come from that time of year, or from that part of the world, celebrated at this time of year. And some of those traditions are the same, like eating with friends. And some of those traditions have changed a little bit, like pumpkins instead of turnips, which good call. And some of those things we don't really think about anymore, like the fairy mounds opening up. And so I encourage you today and over the next week, as you go about your Halloween festivities, dressed like witches and pumpkins and ghosts, I encourage you to look for where you might see those little bits of the long ago past in how we celebrate today. So I am actually going to stay up here today. And Allison is going to just walk everyone downstairs, and our elementary school students are going to join Sarah Rosehill in classroom A to talk about ancestors, and our preschool students are going to join JC and Hayden. And if there's any middle schoolers or kind of like that 5th grade to 9th grade crew, there is also a junior youth group meeting happening right now. So that is in classroom C, which is behind JC's room. So Allison can help anyone find any of those places. And of course, you're also welcome to stay here. My Grampy was named Forrest Maynard Coate, and everyone called him Woody. He died 17 years ago, 2 months after I moved out of California, and this is me at my high school graduation with my Grampy. That ended up being the last time I saw him. I left for college later that summer, and then from college, I went straight to a summer job before moving across the country to Virginia once I decided that absolutely under no circumstances was I going to be a biochem major. Grampy and my Grammy, who died when I was 11, were my dad's parents. And they always seemed like they belonged in a different world from my mom's parents. They always seemed old. They had old-fashioned cars. They wore what I thought of as old-fashioned clothes. And their house had weird, old-fashioned food. My Grampy wore suspenders every day. And he carried around this weird little coin purse. It was kind of circular and had accordion folds, and he would open it up. And he would count out exact change whenever he could. My Grampy was a very good person. He was a devoted member of his church, and he was almost painfully reliable. If he told you he was going to be there at 2 p.m., you better believe that he would be sitting outside in his beige 1984 Chevy Impala with the plasticky seats at 1:55 p.m., and he would expect you, too, to also be ready. I could not imagine my Grampy ever telling a lie. Now, I'd always grown up knowing that Grampy served in the United States Air Corps during World War II. But it wasn't something he really ever talked about. He wasn't active in any veterans groups. I knew that there were some medals somewhere, but I never saw them. And as I got older, I asked about it a little. My Grampy would pick me up from middle school every day in that Chevy Impala, and he would drive me to my mom's house. And even though I was 11, 12, 13, and home all the time, other times, my Grampy would sit on the couch and wait for my mother to come home. And so usually I read books, occasionally I watched TV. But as I got a little older, I started talking to him. And so one time in middle school, based on something we were talking about in school, I pushed him a little bit about World War II. He told me that he'd been drafted. I pushed a little more, and he kind of heaved a sigh, and as I always do, he pushed his glasses up. And it turns out that when he was drafted, my Grampy told what he referred to as a not exactly the truth. My Grampy, it turns out, may have implied that he had slightly more education and engineering experience than he did. So doing the math, he was 19, and I don't know how much they honestly believed him, but to hear my Grampy tell it, his years in the war were spent essentially around large tables doing complicated math problems. His time in the service ended, and he went right into working at an electronics engineer for North American Aviation, which later became Rockwell International. He went there based on the credentials of working in engineering in the Air Force, which he had gotten, if you remember, by telling not exactly the truth. Years later, he did eventually get a college degree in English literature. But he worked there his whole life. He retired holding 14 patents for electrical engineering fuses and optics things. All I know is that as the person who receives some of those patents, I sometimes get a check for between $3 and $5. Turns out they won't send you a check for your patent earnings until they've accrued past $1.50 per year. I'm positive that my grandfather told other lies in his life. He was human. But that story has always stuck with me because he was such a good man. He was such a moral man. And the fact that he would have lied about a thing because he didn't want to fight, because that was against his own morals, and his morality wouldn't let him do anything else. He felt strongly about what he should do, and he did it. There's a lot of privilege there. It certainly would not work out now in this era of digital data. But it was the first time that I'd ever heard someone who I respected imply lying was a good thing. A thing that would be okay to emulate should I need to. It was the first time that an adult in my life had really enforced and endorsed the gray area for me. And that's something that I've carried with me through my years of political activism that my grandpa would absolutely have loathed. I think about him a lot still, even though he's been gone for almost half my life. I think about how he stored slides in Velveeta cheese boxes. How he truly, as smart as he was, did not believe in cordless phones. How he always kept at least half a tank of gas in the car for emergencies, despite the fact that this man did not drive on a freeway for at least the last 30 years of his life. And of course, I think of that big lie that he told when he was 19.
We all belong to so many communities. Communities like a town or a club or a school, and also communities of identity. And this is about a community ancestor I've come to love. When I began working to unlearn some of the standard racist assumptions I grew up with, I had a hard time starting. I had a hard time seeing myself as an anti-racist because I hadn't seen that many anti-racist role models. Or I had, but I couldn't see the lines to how they had gotten there. That changed when I learned about Southern anti-racists like Anne Braden. Incredible white anti-racist icon from my hometown, Louisville, Kentucky, just a little bit older than my grandparents. Can we get her picture up there? Anne Braden grew up white in the South with a typical Jim Crow race consciousness. Not a bad person, just not questioning why things were the way they were. She was a journalist, and in 1946, she covered a march of Black World War II veterans to the Birmingham courthouse. They were marching for the right to vote. This was Braden's anti-racist conversion moment. She and her husband, Carl Braden, from that point on, or think she met him after, but they were active in the civil rights movement for the rest of their lives. In 1954, she and Carl bought a house as a proxy for Andrew and Charlotte Wade, a black couple who had struggled because of Jim Crow policies to buy a home. The Wades faced cross burnings and shot out windows, and after 6 weeks, the house was dynamited while the Wades were out. The Bradens and 5 other white people were charged with sedition, and Carl was actually convicted and sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. But he was released after 8 months when the US Supreme Court invalidated state sedition laws. Anne wrote a book about the sedition trial, The Wall Between, that clearly outlined the workings of Southern white racism. Anne, during her long life, remained committed to racial justice, to connecting the world that is to the world that could be. She protested lynchings and segregation, police brutality, and environmental racism. And she knew that power comes from building coalitions across divides and undoing white racism. She worked for women's rights and LGBT rights. She fought mountaintop removal. She taught in local universities about social justice movements. Even in the last years of her life, she was a fixture at protests in Louisville. I never met Anne Braden in life, though if I had been politically active in high school, it's conceivable that I could have. I guess I wasn't ready then. But learning her history, I see it overlaid on my own. The house that the Wades bought was under 3 miles from where my family lived in the 80s and early 90s. A neighborhood that 30 years later still had very few black residents, even if it was no longer formally segregated. And I just learned that she's buried 10 minutes away from where my father lives now. I think I have a pilgrimage to make the next time I'm home. By choosing to honor her as an ancestor, I see myself as part of an anti-racist line. I don't have to start from nothing. An inheritance of freedom from all the white supremacy I have internalized is mine for the taking, if only I am willing to take it on.
Though I grew up in the Midwest, I found my spiritual ancestors here in Massachusetts. I moved to Concord in the late 1980s, and while living there, I found myself drawn more and more to the New England transcendentalists, whose lives had often intersected in Concord during the 19th century. I signed up for classes and attended a variety of lectures and study groups. And when one of our UU ministers began a series of brown bag lunchtime discussions about transcendentalists, for which participants all contributed research papers, I joined. I was working from home as a freelance writer at the time, so I was usually able to fit this into my schedule. One day, I got a surprise message from a member of our UU congregation who had noticed my interest. She was employed at the UUA in Boston, and she wondered if I might be willing to do some writing for the Tapestry of Faith curriculum they were developing. They were looking for someone who could write biographical stories about historically important Unitarians and Universalists to support various topics in the new curriculum. When we met to discuss it, she showed me a list of some Unitarians and Universalists of the past and asked me to choose someone to write about. I didn't recognize many of the names, but Julia Ward Howe's name popped out at me because a proclamation she had written in hopes of establishing an International Women's Day of Peace had lately been circulating among women's groups, and I was curious about it. The proclamation greatly contrasted with the only other thing I knew about her, that she had written the battle hymn of the Republic. My encounter with Julia Ward Howe has truly changed my life. I read every biography of her I could put my hands on, even though my assignment was only to write a 10-minute read-aloud story. What an introduction to 19th century reform that was. Howe lived from 1819 until 1910, knew nearly every prominent Unitarian of the period, and had connections to nearly every important reform movement. After writing about her, I wrote 11 or 12 more stories for the Tapestry of Faith, and by then, a passion for learning about our Unitarian and Universalist forebears had taken hold of me. It led to my first book, a book that's called Stirring the Nation's Heart, which is a collection of biographical stories, primary source material, and questions for discussion about our UU ancestors. The stories illustrate the central role that UUs played in important reform movements, from new ideas about religion and education to social justice as they worked to abolish slavery, establish women's rights, and advocate for humane treatment of people with disabilities and people living in poverty. As I was reading the journals and private letters and speeches and essays of these reform-minded individuals, I began to think of them as friends. And in conversation, I began to refer to them as my people. These were my ancestors, as surely as anyone in my family tree. In fact, as I was preparing for this morning's focus on ancestors, I was reminded that until my editors and I decided on a title for my book, I always referred to it as my roots book. For all of you who feel drawn to this liberal faith, these are your roots too. And they are sturdy roots on which to grow. We have much to gain from knowing our 19th century UU ancestors who lived through a divisive time when public discourse was at least as rancorous as it is today, and when the challenges that our nation faced were equally daunting. You won't find perfect people. We don't have saints to worship. We have a lineage of women and men who did their best to right society's wrongs. Understanding how they face the challenges of their time can help us better understand and face the challenges of our own.
are a people who acknowledge our ancestors. Ancestors of blood, community, and spirit. Ancestors who have given us legacies through time. Today we will light candles and build an altar for our ancestors. Come forward and light candles here by our chalice. Place pictures and objects of memory on our ancestors' altar. Those joining us by Zoom, I invite you to turn on your camera and share photos and objects and candles with us. We can see the Zoom gallery here in the sanctuary and want your objects on our altar too. As we do not have spoken joys and sorrows today, please write any joys or sorrows that you would like to share with me and the pastoral care team in the Joys and Sorrows book under the windows or in the chat. If you have a picture or object to place on our altar, I invite you to take it out, hold it in your hands, think of the person it represents. What is their legacy? How do they continue to show up in your life? When you're ready, come forward and place your object, and you're welcome to place a seashell if you came holding only memories. Come forward and light candles. Let our ancestors' legacy become visible and tangible in this time. May the candles we light shine brightly and warm our hearts. A light in the memory of our ancestors, we come together, holding our own fragile and resilient lifetimes, holding all that has gone before with fear and hope for the future. Let us build a sacred silence together, full of all we hold in this moment. Spirit of life, death, and connection, we honor our ancestors. We open our hearts, and we grieve for those whose lives ended by violence. The 18 people killed by a gunman in Maine. The thousands killed this month in Gaza and Israel. The many deaths that don't grab top headlines. May we do what we can to change the course of violence in our lifetimes so that our descendants may live in true beloved community. Blessed be. Amen. Please remain seated for our meditation hymn, number 352, Find a Stillness. Find a to say with me the words to extinguish the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. This has been an amazing week in community. Thank you all. We are about to sing This Day We Come. As we get ready to sing, I offer 2 ways to participate. The first is to stay right where you are and be held in the love of our congregation. And the second is to rise in body and spirit, move to the outer aisles, and reach out to those beside you as we sing.